Hello, everyone. My name is Steve, and I'm here today with author Eliot Parker. Eliot, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Steve, thanks so much for having me on the program. Good to be with you.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for coming on and taking the time out of your schedule. I know you're busy, so I appreciate it.
You bet. Glad to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. So, I wanted to talk about your latest book. I noticed that you have quite a few books you've written, but the latest book it's called A Final Call. Can you tell us about it?
Sure. A Final Call is a sequel to a previous book that I had written, a previous thriller called Code for Murder. And it's set in Cleveland, Ohio, and it follows a female homicide detective named Stacy Tabbitt. Um, Stepping back into Code for Murder just for a second, the story starts. The premise of that book is Stacy is wounded in an undercover sting operation that goes bad, and she's knocked unconscious, and her body is dumped into the Cuyahoga River, and she's pulled from the river right before she drowns. Um, but so she doesn't. She survives, but she has lung damage from that incident, and so that's a theme that carries over through that book, but also in A Final Call. But A Final Call picks up about 6 months after Code for Murder ended. She was investigating the death of a Cleveland Browns football player in Code for Murder, and so this picks up a few months after that. Her brother is missing. In A Final Call, she has to find out, that's tied in a little bit back to Code for Murder, but she has to find out where he is and what's happened to him. But as she's trying to find out where he is and what's happened to him, and as she's trying to kind of recover from everything that happened to her in her last investigation, she's approached by a former college classmate, a woman named Monica DeVito, who comes to the police department and asks to speak to Stacy directly and says that her son Brian is missing. Her son Colton is missing, and she feels or fears that something's happened to him, something's bad has happened to him. And at first, Stacy asks her a lot of questions about, well, when was the last time you talked to him? How long have you not been in communication with him? Has he sent you any signals or messages that things are not good? And at first, Stacy thinks that there's nothing wrong, that he's probably just being, a 20-something-year-old who doesn't want to talk to his mom kind of
Yeah.
thing. But then later, she and her partner, Austin Serrera, are called to assist in the homicide investigation of a woman who's been murdered. And they come to find out that the woman is the ex-girlfriend of Colton DeVito. And there is some evidence at the scene that he had been in contact with her recently. So suddenly he becomes a suspect, and suddenly all those things that Monica was concerned about earlier when she had her conversation with Stacy are true, and she realizes, well, maybe something is going on here. And so she tries to find out where he is. Is he involved in the woman's murder? How so? Is he really in Cleveland, or is he somewhere else? And so the chase is on to kind of find him before something happens to him. And as the investigation unfolds, Stacy starts to realize that he is also a target. That Colton is also a target. Somebody's after him for a variety of different reasons. And so you've got this cat and mouse game going on there, but also at the same time, Stacy's trying to find her brother Chance and what happened to him after he goes missing at the end of what happened in Code for Murder. So she's got kind of dueling tracks of things that she's worrying about and trying to investigate and solve as the book unfolds.
Oh, that's a lot happening in a book. Is it hard to manage all those different plot lines, and to make sure that everything makes sense and to keep track of them all?
It can be. One of the things I wrestled with in the drafts of that book is what was going to be the most predominant case that she was investigating. Was it going to be finding Chance, or was it going to be trying to find out what happened to Colton DeVito? And so I played around with it a little bit. I kind of did partial drafts in both scenarios, or with both scenarios, with either Colton being the primary concern that Stacy had, and Chance being the sort of secondary concern, and vice versa. And I feel like the story, the pacing, the plotting went so much better and worked so much better when Colton's investigation was the most important, and then her looking for Chance kind of fills in the backstory as well. So I felt like that was a better way. It kept the plot a lot tighter and more focused that way.
Mhm.
But it also gave the reader, I think, or does give the reader, I think, a chance to breathe a little bit, because the investigation into what's happened to Colton is pretty intense, and it puts Stacy in a lot of physical and psychological turmoil as she's trying to find out what happened to him. And so those moments where she's able to kind of step back from that case and kind of turn her attention to Chance, her brother, and what happened to him, I think lets the reader kind of pause and catch their breath a little bit as well. So I think it just worked a lot better having his investigation, Colton's being the primary thread, and then Chance's situation be kind of the secondary thread in the book.
I'm not a writer. I don't have anywhere near that type of talent, but I always wonder how difficult is it to build suspense and build anticipation through text. How do you have any tricks you use or any kind of methods you use to help get the reader, get their heart pumping and get them that anxious feeling?
Well, that's a great question, Stephen. I think one of the first things that you have to do if you're writing thriller and mystery is you want to make sure when the reader gets to the last page of a chapter that they don't want to put the book down. They don't want to close the book and put it on their nightstand. They don't want to put it back in their purse or under their arm or in their briefcase. You want their eyes to immediately go to the next page of the first page of the next chapter, because you want them to kind of find out, okay, what happened. So you have to build in those cliffhangers. You have to end kind of every chapter with not really a big surprise or a big reveal, but something has to happen to get that reader to turn to the next page. I think you also have to build in enough red herrings. One of the things I've learned over the years is that mystery and thriller readers are really smart, and they're really good at figuring out sometimes early in the story, even before you intend to as a writer, kind of what's happening. And so you've got to use a lot of misdirection. Just when you think that they may figure out who this is, you've got to veer them off into a different direction. So I think that's really important. The red herrings have to make sense. You can't have a red herring involve a character or a situation sort of out of left field that hasn't been tied into the story. You have to be careful about that. But also, I got some really great advice from Derek Nikitas, who is a former professor of mine at Eastern Kentucky University, where I got my MFA. And I was struggling with, I wrote a novel. My first book, Breakdown at Clear River, was written in that program. And we were getting towards the end of the program, and I was really struggling with that tension and plot pacing and all those things that you were just talking about. And he gave me some good advice. He said, look at your book as almost like a movie in your mind, and whatever it is that your character wants or desires, every chapter should either put them a step closer to getting to that goal, whatever that want or desire is, or a step back further from getting that want or desire or whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. So when I thought about it from that perspective, and that's been advice that has set with me ever since then, because every time I'm working on a new book, I think about that. I think about as I get to the end of the chapter, okay, have I taken Stacy or Ronan or another character? Are they closer to getting what it is that they're looking for, or have they been set back in some way by either someone else or something else happening to them? And so sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back from chapter to chapter. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But eventually, they do have to either get what they want or not get what they want. But every chapter functions as kind of a progress or setbacks in that regard. So that's helped me too as well. Kind of keep the pacing and the tension tight throughout the chapters.
Wow, it sounds like a lot to balance, and to have that bringing the character closer or farther away constantly it sounds like a lot to juggle. Sometimes it must be a little tough to do all that and to keep it consistent.
It is. I feel like when I'm writing a thriller, the first draft is sort of like my brain dump draft. It's just getting everything on the page. And it's really in those second and third and sometimes fourth rewrites where I start to see those things happening successfully or not happening successfully, in terms of making sure all those plot points work and making sure that that you don't forget about a clue that you dropped on the reader in chapter 3 and haven't addressed it in 10 more chapters, but it's important to the case. You need to go back and revisit that. But for me, that doesn't happen sometimes until the second or third revision, when I can get kind of the basic structure and the characters established and the main plot line established. Once I feel like I've done that, then I feel like that's where I go in and work on those finer details in that second and third revision. So for me, as a writer, I feel like the writing really comes in the revision. That's where for me as a writer, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where stuff gets taken out. That's where characters get more richly defined. That's where the plot is tightened. That's where the setting is elaborated upon. As it needs to be is in those rewrites. And that's where I feel like I have to spend the most time for me as a writer. But I feel like when I do have good writing, it comes in those revision drafts.
And do you have someone that you bounce ideas off of, or do you kind of say, hey, read this chapter and see what you think? Do you have someone in your life that gives you tips or kind of gives you feedback as you're going through these revisions?
I do. I have a couple of I have 3 or 4 beta readers that I use pretty consistently. One of them is a thriller writer, and a Seamus award-winning thriller writer. Has also been a finalist for the McCavity Award for thriller writing, and I won't mention his name because he may not want me to.
Okay.
I don't think he would mind, but I want to protect his anonymity. But so I have a thriller writer, but I also have 2 other beta readers in my group. I also have another beta reader who's a novelist, doesn't write thrillers, but writes novels. But then I have 2 other beta readers in my group who are not novelists and or mystery thriller writers. I have a poet in my reader group, and I also have a nonfiction writer in my beta reader group, because they, as writers, are also engaged in the creative process, but they bring a fresh perspective to the work that maybe I wouldn't get if I was just having everybody who was a novelist or everybody who was a thriller writer in my beta group. And so it's really interesting to get a poet's perspective on a certain chapters, and a nonfiction writer's perspective on chapters and a few chapters. And I'm also a member of 2 creative writing groups here. I live in Oxford, Mississippi. I teach English at Ole Miss. So I'm a member of the Oxford Comma Writing Group, which is here in Oxford. I'm also a member of a group called Malice in Memphis, which is all mystery and thriller writers in the Memphis, Tennessee area. I'm about an hour southeast of Memphis, Tennessee. It'd be the closest big city to where I am. And so being in those writing groups is really helpful as well, because I get some feedback from them in terms of ideas or things I'm kicking around in my mind, and then I can give them feedback on things that they're working on. So I would say if folks are trying to build a beta reading group, get some people that write in your genre, but also reach out to some people that aren't in your genre, because I get a lot of valuable feedback. Some of the best feedback I've gotten on drafts has been from my poet reader and my nonfiction beta reader. So it just adds a lot of diversity to your group, and you get a lot of really good feedback that way.
So how different is their feedback? Has there been times when they all give you different feedback? And if so, how do you decide where to go from there?
That's a great question. It's really interesting, Steve, because even if the feedback is different, that there are kernels or threads that emerge. I'll just give you an example for a final call. There were a few chapters that both the nonfiction reader and the poet reader had said, I can't really tell you're in Cleveland. I need more setting description. I mean, I know we're in Cleveland, and I know this because I've read the other 6 chapters. But if I was picking this up midway through, I mean, you could be in Oxford, Mississippi, or you could be in Charleston, West Virginia, or you could be in Los Angeles, California. I need more setting, and that's also something that my thriller beta reader had suggested too. He said, you had really good setting description, really good establishment of the atmosphere in these chapters, but now you've kind of tapered off there. So remind us where we are. Remind us that we're in this big port city of Cleveland, Ohio, right by Lake Erie, and there should be breezes coming off the lake, and there should be kind of the sights and smells and sounds of a big city, and all of that. And so even though all 4 of the perspectives I got were different, the common thread was do something with setting, add more setting, more sensory description, more sense of atmosphere for where we are, because otherwise we could be just standing anywhere going through this. And so I found that has been the case. Even when I've gotten 4 different opinions on something, when I sit down and read them kind of in totem all at once, I will see that there's oftentimes kernels or threads that pop up in different ways in all of that feedback. And so I don't know if that's just because I don't know if those beta readers know me well, probably do know me pretty well, or but it's just amazing how that happens. And they don't really know each other, so it just sort of happens organically. But that also helps me as a writer, because I feel like, well, if I get positive feedback along those lines, I'm heading in the right direction. If I get feedback like the setting example I was using a moment ago, then I realize, okay, I've got to go back and fix this, because I'm getting 4 different readers all kind of telling me the same thing in different ways.
Oh, wow. And is there a reason you picked Cleveland for the setting? Do you have an attachment to Cleveland, or did you grow up there, or have you visited, or?
Well, my dad's family, my dad's side of the family, I'm from West Virginia originally. Grew up in Charleston, West Virginia, and his family, they were coal miners and laborers. And when the coal mines and the coal industry went through its first downturn in the late 60s, early 70s, and the mines shut down, they all moved north and went to Cleveland and
Mm.
worked for the Goodyear plant, the Goodyear rubber plant in Akron. They worked in the steel mills and the shipyards down there on Lake Erie during the period where the lake was catching on fire because of all the, all the pollution and things that were being dumped into the water. So people might remember that. Listeners might remember that period in history. And so we would go up there a lot to visit them, and we became big Browns fans as a result of that because they were all big Browns fans. And so I can remember that now. Unfortunately, they're all deceased now, including my father, unfortunately. But but Cleveland has a really special place, and it's just such a great place, Steve, to set a city, it's a great city to set a story because I love port cities. I love cities right by big bodies of water. I just love that because you get that rustic kind of gritty feel on the outer edges of the city, right up against the water. But Cleveland is such a great city because you literally have these gentrified neighborhoods all next to each other. So for example, you've got Tower City and all the shopping and the BP headquarters is there. And you've got, all the skyscrapers and everything that you would see in a major city in one part of town. You go 2 or 3 blocks over and you're in the Little Italy neighborhood, which is a very ethnic and culturally diverse area. You go 2 blocks further from that, and then you get into some of the squalor that people oftentimes associate negatively with big cities, and it's all within several blocks of one another. So these people interact with each other and come across each other every day, and so it's a great place to set a story, to set a thriller, especially because from Stacy's perspective, she's got to know all of those neighborhoods and all of their demographics and kind of the pulse of those neighborhoods. But also it's challenging because these people are all interacting with each other and coming across each other every day. So it makes it tough for her to kind of sift through the cultural mores of each of those neighborhoods while trying to figure out, okay, what happened to this victim that I'm trying to solve, or trying to apprehend the killer for this victim. So it's just a great city to set. If folks haven't been to Cleveland, you really should go. Go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Go to the Great Lakes Science Center. They have a wonderful, lot of museums there. They have a wonderful symphony orchestra. The Cleveland Symphony Orchestra, Philharmonic Orchestra is terrific, one of the best in the country. So a lot to see there and a lot to do. But it's a fascinating city if you want to set some type of a kind of a thriller mystery story.
Oh, maybe I should. I've driven through, but we've never stopped. So somewhere on the way to somewhere else. One of these days. So were there any inspirations because it sounds like almost a procedural story with Stacy. So were there any inspirations that inspired you to write this type of story, or movies or other books that you love that really got that, give you that bug to write this kind of story?
Well, I tell you, I've been a mystery thriller reader all the way going back to elementary school. My very first set of books that I can remember reading as a kid were the old Encyclopedia Brown mystery stories. And I don't know if you're familiar with those or not. The author, unfortunately, that wrote those just passed away a few years ago. So I read all of those. And they were cute little, very, very G-rated mysteries that took place in this neighborhood. And Encyclopedia Brown would very much be his name wasn't Encyclopedia. They nicknamed him that because he very much was a genius. He would be considered an IQ of 200 kind of kid if we were comparing that today. But you put a little quarter in the canister, and he would solve the neighborhood mystery. And it was usually someone's cat's gone missing, or someone's bike. Yeah, somebody punctured somebody's bike tire on purpose or something like that. But I love those stories. And he had a girl in the story who was that really liked him and wanted to be his boyfriend, but he saw her no more as a friend. And so you had that kind of underlying story that ran through all the books. And then as I got a little older, Scholastic used to have these choose your own mysteries, where you would read, it would say something like, if you want Cody to go down the path, turn to page 35. If you want Cody to go home, turn to page 56. So it was wonderful marketing technique for them because you ended up getting 2 books for one at the price of one, and you could go through and see what Cody did, make certain decisions, then go back and read it again and make different decisions and find out what happened in the mystery. So that got me started on that a long time ago. But there's just so many great mystery thriller writers that I love. Walter Mosley's wonderful. His Easy Rollins series is just fantastic. I'm a huge fan of C.J. Box. His Joe Pickett series is terrific. If you haven't read that, I would encourage anyone to read them. And you can pick up the series I think he's got 17 books in the series now about Joe Pickett, who's a game warden out in Wyoming. Um, but you can pick up any of his books and find out kind of what's going on. You don't have to read them in order, reading the previous books. Recently, in terms of Appalachian, because I'm from Appalachian, kind of an Appalachian boy,
Yeah.
David Joy has been writing just some killer sort of Appalachian noir over the last several years. Ron Rash is another writer, teaches at Western Carolina University. He does a lot of Southern Appalachian noir stories. So I would say those four writers have influenced me the most. In terms of other writers that have influenced me, my favorite classical writer of all time was John Steinbeck.
Hmm.
I think everybody talks about Of Mice and Men and Grapes of Wrath, which is wonderful and well deserving. But I think his best book was East of Eden, which is basically his retelling of the Cain and Abel story from the Bible, which is just fascinating. But what I loved about Steinbeck is he wrote bad guys that you loved to hate, but at the same time you rooted for them and you felt sorry for them to some degree. And so when I'm writing villains for thriller stories, I have to realize that, they have wants and needs, and despite all of their terrible things, that they're human too. And Steinbeck was so good at that. If you think about George and Lenny from Of Mice and Men and the men they come across at that work camp, even though they're treated terribly and they do some terrible things, that they're trying to seek kind of the same things George and Lenny are. I can just go on about that, but in his description of setting was just wonderful. I mean, I think nobody wrote the Salinas Valley in California any better than him. And then another writer who sadly has passed away, whom I loved, was Pat Conroy. I just thought the way he could build characters, the way he could create characters, a lot of them were based on his own family, if you know anything about him. But he was just so good at building and creating these multi-layered characters that you at times wanted to strangle, at times you wanted to hug them, at times you wanted to, have a brick fall on their head or something like that. But he understands people and what motivates people, what brings people together, what pushes people apart as characters. So those were really, his books were really helpful to me in that regard. So I would say those writers have had the biggest influence on me.
No. And if someone wanted to read a Final Call, should they read a Code for Murder first? Or can you jump into a Final Call and be okay?
You can jump into a Final Call and be okay. There's enough conversation Stacy has with other people in the book, and enough reflection that she has at certain moments in the book that will fill in the gaps for what happened in Code for Murder. Certainly, I would love for you to go back and read Code for Murder first if you're interested. But no, you can pick up a Final Call and get a sense of what happened in Code for Murder and kind of why Stacy is where she is at this point in her life and in her career, and why Chance went missing and her injury that she suffered, and why that's still an important part of who she is and what she has to deal with in a Final Call. So yeah, you can certainly pick it up and be able to enjoy that as a standalone book, but also get enough of the backstory for what happened in Code for Murder too.
Yeah, I know that would be a question some people have, but I'm a completionist, so I can't jump into this. I have to start from the beginning. I can't just jump in the middle. My OCD doesn't like that. So even if it's way back 5 books earlier, then I have to start at the beginning.
I was mentioning CJ Box a minute ago, and that's how I discovered him. Is a friend of mine, a former colleague of mine, said, you need to be reading CJ Box. And so I was at a bookstore somewhere and I picked up a copy of his book, and I was like book 6 or 7 into the Pickett series. And yes, it was a standalone. It had enough allusions to what had happened before, but I was like you, Steve. I had to go back and start at book 1. I'm like, nope, I got to figure out how we got to book 7 first. So I stopped, went back, read all the way up through book 7. So glad I did. But yeah, I'm that way too. If I pick it up midway through, I got to go back and read it all so I can get a sense of kind of what's happened.
Yeah, definitely. I can't do that. I have to start at the beginning. And I've talked to a few different authors, and it's always fascinating to me that everyone has a different some type of different experience publishing their work. So what was your experience like when you were getting your books published for the first time?
Well, it was interesting. My first book was Breakdown at Clear River, which I was talking about a minute ago, that I finished in my EKU, my MFA program at EKU. And that was published by a small publisher. I had attended a writing workshop in Charleston, West Virginia, right after I'd graduated and got my MFA. And it was a writing workshop that was held at the state capitol. They'd been doing it for years. And, one of the best parts about going to things like that is the networking. And so we had a lunch, like a catered lunch, where everybody that attended, speakers, attendees, people from the West Virginia Humanities Council were all there. And so I just happened to sit next to a publisher who was there. He was on a panel about publishing. His name was Patrick Grace, and he was on a panel about publishing. And I didn't have a chance to go to that because I went to a different workshop, so I missed that session. But anyway, I ended up talking to him at lunch. And he was asking me, "Where have you written anything?" I told him about the book, told him I just finished it as part of my MFA. And he said, "Well, why don't you, here's my card. Why don't you send me a couple chapters? Let me take a look." Well, I just thought he was being nice to me because, I'm the guy he had to sit across from at lunch. And so, he was just humoring me, being nice to me. He's like, "Well, got to be nice to this kid who, because this was in 2010 or 11, and just be nice to this kid, sitting across from me." But I didn't really follow through, which was silly on my part. But then he had found me, he'd gotten a hold of me. So I don't remember if we'd exchanged email addresses or what. That's been so long ago. But anyway, he reached out to me on email and said, "Hey, I'm still interested in looking at a couple chapters." And so I sent it to him, and he ended up publishing the book.
Wow.
It was hugely successful. It was nominated for the Weatherford Award that year for Appalachian fiction. It was a mystery. It was a thriller story set on a fictional college campus in West Virginia, and the story was one of the college students, Dane Antonelli, who played on the football team, was found dead in a dormitory stairwell prior to the start of the semester. And so you have to kind of find out what happened to him and who put him there and why and all of that. So that's how it got started for me. It got started with me a small press. Then from that, I had an agent who was my agent about 9 months. She decided that she wanted to go have a family. She'd gotten married recently during that time and wanted to start a family. So she got out of the agenting business. So I lost my agent almost as quickly as I got her.
Oh no.
And then, which was interesting, and it was fine. And we parted ways amicably, and she's doing well. I think she's had another child since then, and she's enjoying being a mom, which is great. And so, and then in terms of finding my other publishers, some of it has been through querying other agents who have said, this isn't for me, or I've just sold a book that meets this, that's on this topic or on this theme. But reach out to my friend so and so at this publishing house and tell them that I told you to contact them, and I think this would be a good fit for them. So I found one of my publishers through that venue. In fact, the publisher that has done a final call and has done for my book before this one, A Knife's Edge, was found that way. Was a referral from an agent who said, Headline Books publishes both of those, and said, I've just sold this, but I know Headline Books. This is right up their alley. Tell them I told them to contact. Tell them I said contact them. And so that's kind of how the journey has been for me. It's been a lot, but a lot of that has been, attending conferences, attending workshops, going to publishing panels, pitching agents when you have an opportunity to sign up for a pitch session at these conferences. Getting names and faces, getting your name out there, getting your work out there, but also putting a name and a face together for publishing professional publishers and agents. And so I've learned a great deal, met a lot of awesome people through the process. Even if they were people that didn't accept my work, I've maintained contact with them. And so that's kind of how it's been. Sort of been a long, winding journey with a lot of bumps and stops and starts along the way. But that's just a part of the process. That's just a part of being a writer. That's a part of being an artist of any kind where you have creative work. It's such a subjective thing, and what may not be a good fit for somebody in September of 2021 might be a great fit for somebody in August of 2022. You don't know, and you don't know that until you reach out and say, "Hey, here's my book, here's my collection of short stories, here's my whatever. What do you think?" And that oftentimes is how you kind of get started. You have to have a few setbacks and lots of rejections, and but all it does, as I remind myself and tell people all the time, all it takes is one person to say yes. And when that one person says yes, then there you go. Then you're on your way.
Yeah, experiencing so much success with your first book, did you feel pressure going into your second book or having a follow up that matched the same? But did that add pressure, or did you add pressure on yourself? No, having that success with the first book and trying to match it on the second.
Actually, yes. And after the book had been out a year and it got nominated for the Weatherford Award that year, it just so happened to be it got nominated right about the time the book had been out for a year. So we sort of had a little, Patrick and I and some the other people that had worked on the book, on the cover design and the typesetting people, we all had a little party to celebrate, happy 1 year book birthday for Breakdown Clear River. So we had a really nice meal, had some cake and some beverages, and really had a nice time. And then as we're leaving, Patrick pats me on the back and he says, most authors never have the same success on their sophomore book like they had for their first book. And I just looked at him and I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, debut authors' books who do really well, their second book tends to not live up to the hype and all of that. And at first I thought, oh, does this mean that he doesn't think I can do another book and all of, I had all these doubts as a writer. But I think what he was doing, he was being honest, because there is a lot of truth to that. If you look at authors' second books who've had really hot debuts, not always, but a lot of them, not that they're not good and not successful, but they kind of have a little dip down in the success or the pizzazz that comes with that second book. But I think he was also at the same time giving me some advice and a warning to, hey, you've got to keep it up, you've got to step it up, you've got to not just maintain, but you've got to get better. Don't rest on your laurels. Don't sit back and say, oh, well, look how good Breakdown at Clear River did. No, I've made it. I can just kind of, fluff off here a little bit. I think he was giving me advice nicely and warning me that, hey, you've got to keep at it. You've got to bring it, quote unquote, bring it to the next book, just like you did this one. And there's no, and later on, we talked later, a couple years after that, he told me that, and that's pretty much what he said. He said, yeah, I wanted you to know that, I didn't want you to rest on your laurels, and I didn't want you to get the big head. And I wanted you to write with the same passion and intensity with your next books that you did with this book. And since then, Patrick has retired, since all of this transpired, and his publishing company's been sold and purchased by someone else. I'm not sure who now, but so he kind of politely but passively aggressively stoked me into making sure that I kept those things in mind when it came to the and he also emphasized, said, you're only as good as your most recent book. So you may have done all these things with book 1 or 2 or 3, but you're only judged on the book that you've got coming out next. And so that stuck with me as good advice. So yes, there was pressure on me with that next book. Absolutely.
Yeah, I kind of think about it as in the music industry, when an artist comes out and they have a successful single and gets radio play, and then the second, I can imagine the pressure that you must feel to at least match or have more success with the second book. And there's these expectations now, and it's a whole different experience for sure.
Yeah. Another friend of mine said, when I was telling him what Patrick had told me, he said, oh yeah, he doesn't want you to be a one-hit wonder like musicians are, you hear these musicians have this big hit and then you never hear from them again. And so, yeah, absolutely true. Yeah. You have to put the same amount of effort and work into your next project as you did. And in some ways, even more, I think, than you did with your second or third or fourth work as you did with your first.
Mm-hmm. And you really have to, like you mentioned, you have to be persistent. And I have talked to a few authors about querying and writing query letters, and it must be so soul crushing to get rejections all the time. And eventually you'll get an acceptance, but in the meantime, it must be really frustrating to get rejection and rejection and rejection, knowing that eventually you'll get an acceptance letter. Hopefully you will, but that must be really tough to query like that.
It is, and you have to go at it with a battle plan. I have an Excel sheet when I've done that, when I've gotten to querying and keeping track of who I send things to, and sometimes you get a response, sometimes you get a rejection letter, sometimes you don't hear anything at all. I think those are the worst. I think more so than the rejection, Steve, are the ones where you feel like you've been ghosted. I sent you this query letter. You said that you'd get back with me in 3 months. It's been 6 months and I've heard nothing. Yeah. That limbo status, I think, is the worst. But you just can't take it personally. It's not. Oftentimes, a rejection, and I've learned this going to a lot of writing conferences and listening to agents and publishers talk about this. A lot of times it has nothing to do with the quality of the writing or the storytelling that you have or the characters or the theme or whatever. It just has to do with what have they published recently, what's on their publishing schedule. If it's a publisher, what's on their publishing schedule for next year. If it's an agent, have I just sold 2 or 3 manuscripts with similar ideas or similar plot lines and themes? And so there's so many things that oftentimes don't make a manuscript a good fit with a publisher or an agent, that don't have anything to do with you personally, and certainly don't have anything to do with your writing ability or your storytelling ability. And that said, I feel like the best query rejections I get are the ones where, and they don't come often, but the ones where an agent or a publisher will give you some feedback and will say, this book wasn't a fit for me, but here's what I really liked about it, and here's where I was confused or I lost interest. Sometimes that's just a sentence or two. Sometimes it's just a couple of sentences. Either way, but that's really, really valuable to me, because I feel like, as busy as they are, they took they saw the potential in the manuscript, and they took the time to give me some personalized feedback on what was working and what wasn't working. And so that has oftentimes led me to another rewrite. That has oftentimes led me to, pausing my querying and going back and thinking, okay, maybe I need to go back, and because this was an agent I really wanted to try to snatch, or this was a publisher that I really wanted to take my book, and they're taking the time to give me some feedback. I need to kind of go back and look at what they're suggesting and see if there's areas I need to improve upon. So yes, and nobody likes to be rejected. Nobody likes to be told that, your work's not a good fit. But what I've learned over the years, Steve, is that a lot of it it's not about your storytelling or about your writing. It's about 16 other factors that you don't have any idea about. And oftentimes when you do get those personalized rejections where they've said, this is what I liked, and this is where you lost me, or this is where I think the story slowed down for me, really take those to heart, because someone has taken the time to give you that feedback, as busy as they are. And to me, that's the best kind of rejection letter to get. But the hardest ones for me aren't the rejections; it's the ghosting. It's just you send out a query letter and you hear nothing back, and it just kind of goes out into the ether, and then you never, never hear anything, yay or nay, even if it's past the deadline. So those are the worst, I think.
Oh yeah, that's got to be frustrating for sure. And in the past several years, with Amazon KDP and self-publishing, how much has the publishing industry changed in the past 5 years, or even since the start of the pandemic? It seems like a lot more people are self-publishing because they have time home and they're writing that book they've always wanted to write, and now they have an avenue to get it published. How much has that changed the industry?
Well, that's a great question, Steve. From my perspective, I feel like there's never been a better time to be a writer, because you have so many avenues for getting your story out there to an audience. That said, it's also more challenging on the flip side of that, sort of on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are so many ways that people can get their work out there. How are you going to get your work noticed from the crowd? How are you going to get, your work noticed? And I was giving a workshop at the Louisville Book Festival before COVID, and I found a story from the Washington Post had done on ebooks versus printed books. And their data was from 2017, but in 2017, 648,000 books had been published in that calendar year. Now that includes traditionally published, small published, or indie published books, but also self-publishing titles. So if you publish a story in any one of those formats in 2017, you were going up against 647,999 other titles that had been released.
Wow.
And so the challenge comes, and I'm sure that's only gone up, as you said, with the pandemic and everything, and everybody home and plenty of time on their hands, as we couldn't go anywhere or do anything much other than work and spend time with our families, which, that can also cause problems too if you have too much togetherness time. But, so that's the challenge, I think, in terms of publishing today, is how are you going to get your work noticed out from how are you going to get it to stand out from the crowd? And I know Amazon and KDP has all kinds of different marketing tools and packages that they offer. You can publish your book with KDP for free, but there's some add-on services that you can have. I work with a publicist. I've been working with a publicist for the last several years on my books, because I want to spend that time writing and not doing all of that time you know, calling newspapers and reaching out to shows and that kind of thing. And that's worked out really well for me. That's helped me tremendously because it helps me focus on the writing. And I'm happy to speak and talk and do workshops and all of that. But I work better when somebody says, "Okay, here's what I've signed you up for. Can you do this?" As opposed to me having to try to do that and work on the next project. And so, but that's not for everybody. I mean, some people don't want to use a publicist. They maybe can't afford it, or they're on certain circumstances. So that's really the big challenge, I think, going forward is as a writer, how are you going to get your work noticed? I encourage folks all the time to go to craft festivals, go to Christmas shows, go to for example, I'm going to the Southern Christmas Show next week in Charlotte, North Carolina to sell books of a final call. And you might think, well, that's not Barnes and Noble or that's not an independent bookstore. That's true, but there's 200,000 people that come to that Christmas show, every year, and I'm the only person there selling books.
Oh, yeah.
There's 4 people selling wreaths. There's 3 people selling homemade fudge. There's 3 people selling those yard signs that you put in your front yard, but I'm the only person there selling books. So even if I don't sell a lot of books, people are going to come up and talk to me because I'm offering a product. They're going to come up and talk about what they've read recently or what they like to read or who's a favorite author of theirs. And so it's an opportunity to pass out information, make connections with readers that way. So, those are some tips I would give, in addition to what we've been talking about. Find places where you can sell your book, but you're not competing with a shelf full of books at Barnes and Noble or a shelf full of books at your independent bookstore. And that's not to discredit those places. Both of those places are wonderful for authors at all levels. And certainly I wouldn't be where I am today without independent bookstores. But at the same time, if you really want to stand out and really want to market your product, find places where you can be the only author selling books at those venues. But that's going to be, I think, our big challenge as we look at the next 5-10 years in publishing is we have all these books coming out and all these different platforms, ebooks and Kobo books and iTunes, iBooks and printed books and traditionally published books, small press books. How do we sift through the noise and get your work noticed? That's going to be, I think, the real challenge. And I don't know that there's a clear answer to that, Steve. I mean, you could try a lot of those things we just talked about. You may have some success and you may not. It just may be one of those things where you can't break through. I mean, I've had some books that have sold much better than others, even though I think the storyline for the ones that didn't sell as well was better than the ones that did sell well. So you just don't know. You just don't know. But that's the real challenge is how do you get your book to stand out from the crowd?
Something you've mentioned with when you were meeting with publicists or you're networking with people and you're out there meeting people at festivals. You mentioned that a couple of times about making connections, and that goes a long way when you meet someone in person and you have a chance to talk to them. Even if it's a 20-second conversation, they won't forget it. But in this new world with social media and the pandemic, it makes it harder to meet people. Is that becoming a lost art almost? Is that face-to-face meeting people and connecting with people that way? Is that becoming something that doesn't happen as often anymore?
I'm worried about that a little bit, Steve. I'm worried that we have, because the pandemic has taken a little bit longer to sort of subside than I think a lot of us thought it was going to. I think we have the sort of the Zoom groups have sort of taken over. I can tell you from a couple authors that I'm friends with that I've met through those events that you're talking about and those conferences and workshops and things that have done Zoom events. While the Zoom event was a great opportunity for them to meet people and they were able to talk about their book to people, and if they were, let's say, in North Carolina or South Carolina, they had people in their Zoom room from Oregon and Los Angeles and Austin, Texas, and places that maybe they couldn't get to. At the same time, it did not always translate into sales. And there's something, and I don't want to say that writing is all about making money, but I'm just using this as an example because to kind of tie into what you're talking about, because it's very easy in a Zoom room for me to go up and click the red X when I'm finished and go on and do the dishes or have dinner with my family or, go take the dog out for his nightly walk or whatever and get back into my routine of life. And then next thing I know, I've forgotten, even though you've told me how I could get a copy of your book or where I could find out more information, that's kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
If I'm at an event and you're physically standing in front of me, or I'm standing over your table and you're there, and you've got the book in your hand, and I can hold it and I can feel it and I can touch it and I can see you physically in front of me talking about the book, and I can witness your passion, and I can see the nonverbals, and I can have
Right.
all of those things that make face-to-face communication so rich and valuable. The chances of me selling that book are higher, but also the chances of me making a connection with you, as you said, even if it's for 20 seconds, are so much stronger. And so I posed that question to a couple of bookstores that, in my area, just independent bookstores. And while a lot of them use those Zoom virtual events, and some are still using them because, of the situation, and depending on where they live and what the restrictions are, they have no choice. Or if it's Barnes and Noble, the company mandate is still in effect, no in-person bookstore events until at least 2022. So there's a variety of different factors there. But even bookstore managers that you talk to hope we get back to, or I've talked to anecdotally, hope we get back to face-to-face events, because putting on those Zoom book events are a lot of work for them. You've got to get the technology, you've got to do the email back and forth, make sure everybody gets the Zoom link, make sure it works, make sure the people that you got to sign people up, you've got to send them the Zoom links and on it, all this kind of stuff. It's a lot of work for them, and it's they miss the traffic in their stores. I had one bookstore manager tell me, he said, what we miss about the in-person events is not just having the authors here and the people that they bring, but just the camaraderie, the energy that's missing from the store, from those events where people are in and they're laughing and talking and friends are reconnecting. Somebody comes to the book signing, they run into Sally, who they go to church with and they haven't seen in 3 months, and next thing you know, then Sally introduces Susie to her husband Bill, who maybe she's heard about him and has never met him. Those kinds of things are, you don't get that in a Zoom room, you don't get that
Right.
in a virtual event, and so I hope we get back to those. I think so, but I'll be honest, I think we as authors have to speak up and demand that these things come back. I think there is again, this is just from my perspective. I mean, I've attended a lot of Zoom events during the pandemic and talked to a lot of authors. Just, I love to ask them this question all the time about Zoom versus face-to-face. And I think we as authors, and to some degree, publishers and publicists, have to start pushing to get these things back on the schedule as soon as possible. Because if not, if we don't push and say, hey, push politely and kindly that we want these things to come back. We want in-person book festivals to come back. We want the Southern Festival of Books in Nashville to be a virtual, face-to-face event again. We want the National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. to be a face-to-face event again. We want bookstore signings back in our independent bookstores. We want bookstore signings back at Books A Million and Barnes and Noble. And we want these things. If we don't start speaking up, and kindly and gently, I think, advocating that we as authors are ready to come back to your store and do these things. We're ready to come back to Tennessee and DC and Tucson and do these book festivals. We're ready to come back and do this. I think you're going to see more of the Zoom things continue, and I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, it'll become the norm if it
Yeah.
goes on too long.
Yeah. It's just like the old adage, once something goes away and disappears, it sometimes doesn't come back. And I think we may be getting to that point with some of these virtual face-to-face things. I don't think they'll ever go away totally either way, but I think that you're going to start to see the scales tip more towards virtual. If we as authors and publishers and publicists don't start saying, hey, we want these things back, we find value in the face-to-face, and we're willing to come do it. We're willing to travel and do it and be there and meet readers and shake hands and take pictures and sign autographs and do all those things.
Because even just having it, not only just meeting face to face, but having an autographed copy of a book, I mean, that's something that people cherish. Even if they're lukewarm on the book, it's a signed book. Then they met the author and they connected with them, and it's an experience they won't forget. So it goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know some authors have have used book plates and those kinds of templates for the virtual events. You're a big writer, certainly. John Grisham and CJ Box, like we were talking about earlier. That's certainly a norm for them. But you're right. Nothing beats the actual. He took a blue pen and really signed it, or addressed it to me specifically, and it's in his handwriting or her handwriting. Yeah, that's just an experience you can't replicate, even with a book plate. I mean, there's and you can say, hey, I met this and I got my picture taken with them and all of that. Yeah, that's that connection that makes reading and writing so special, and readers and writers such a special relationship, I think.
Yeah. So you start with an idea, and you mold this idea into a book, and you go through revisions, and you go through edits, and you change it, and you sculpt it, and you go through you get feedback on it, and you get a publisher, and you go through all this stuff. Okay, so you go through all these things to get your book out there. How do you then go from that to have your book in a major bookstore like Barnes and Noble? What's that process like?
It's a I don't want to say a laborious process, but it's a time sensitive situation. It doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen overnight. We were talking about publishing through Amazon and KDP. Well, you can get that uploaded, click available, and suddenly it's available.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way with Barnes and Noble and Books a Million and even independent bookstores. Basically what will happen, and it depends on your publisher. It also depends on if you're working with a publicist, either inside of that publishing company or house, or if you're working with a publisher that you've hired existentially outside of the house. Usually about 6 to 9 months before the book comes out, that process starts. The process
Wow.
of contacting Barnes and Noble, contacting the American Wholesale Book Company, who's known as Books a Million, contacting the National Indie Organization, whose acronym escapes my mind at the moment, but contacting all of these distributors and saying, we've got a book coming out. Here's what it's about. Here's what the cover looks like. Here's the blurbs that we've gotten already for the book. And this is from Eliot Parker, who previously wrote these books, and he won these awards, or has presented here, or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. So that process kind of starts about 9 months, usually about 9. Sometimes it can go also up to 12 months, depending on the time that your book's going to come out. So that process starts about 9 months ahead of time, so that when the release date happens or is getting ready to happen, those bookstores can have those books on their shelves and ready to go to meet readers on the release day. Now, I've found that for myself personally, it's easier to find those books on the shelves with my books in places that I have connections to. So I went to school. I got my MFA at EKU and my doctorate at University of Kentucky. So I have a connection there, spent a lot of time there. So it's easy for me to get my books in those bookstores in Kentucky. I'm from West Virginia originally. And so it's easy to get my books there. I live in Mississippi now. It's easy to get my books in all those stores there. In terms of Oregon, California, Oklahoma, places like where I don't have a strong connection, sometimes it takes a while for those books to matriculate on the shelves there. But Barnes and Noble and American Wholesale Book Company and those places are going to want to put books where people, I have strong connections, and I have connections to those communities in those areas. So it just depends, and that's different for every author. It's different depending on the genre of book you're writing, depending on when your book's coming out, how it's going to be stocked and all of that. But usually that's something that the publisher deals with those vendors directly, or your publicist deals with those vendors directly and says, hey, we got this book coming out in May of 2022. Here it is. We'd love for you to order some. So all that kind of happens outside of the author's purview. I can certainly inquire about that and kind of how's it going and that kind of thing. But that's really a conversation that happens sort of with me, not in the middle of it. But yeah, so if you see a book on the shelves, let's say, or a book coming out next Tuesday, Tuesday tends to be a big release day for new books. The chances that they started that process probably in the spring of last year, gearing up for that release, between contacting the vendors, making sure there were enough books printed, making sure the shipping was going to be done at a certain time, making sure the reviews are there, making sure that everything's ready to go. So it usually starts. So we just wind back about 9 months, and that's really when that process actually started to get that book on the shelf that you see at the bookstore.
Wow, that's a long process.
Yes, it is. It is.
Process.
Yeah, it is not. It is not for the faint of patience, I guess, for people that don't have a lot of patience. It's a lot of hurry up and wait, but it's worth it in the end, I think.
And you mentioned blurbs. How do blurbs work? How do you get a blurb on your book?
Well, you can really do it two ways. You can have the publisher will reach out oftentimes to authors that they have published in the past who maybe have published similar works to yours, and we'll ask them to blurb. But we were talking about connections earlier,
Hmm.
and meeting people at conferences and workshops and things like that. I've gotten some of the best blurbs by just reaching out to authors myself and saying, I got Amanda Ward, who's a New York Times bestselling author. Her recent book, The Jet Setters, came out, I believe, last year or the year before. Maybe it was the year before COVID. And she's had a number of New York Times bestselling books. I met her at a. I know her and have met her through several different venues, and have read her books and reached out to her and said, and so we met face to face. And I said, "Hey, would you like to blurb my book?" She said, "I'd love to," and she gave it a great blurb. So that's where making those connections and relationships can come into play, because if those writers know who you are, and you were able to, if you've read their work or they know who you are, and you had a good relationship, a good conversation, I have found that the only time I've ever had, I'll say this, the only time I've ever had an author say they would not blurb my book if we had a connection. Now, I certainly would not just email John Grisham and say, "John Grisham, please blurb my next book." He's gonna be like, "Who's this Eliot Parker person?" But I queried John Hart, for example, and asked him to blurb a book for me one time. And John Hart's books are just wonderful, just wonderful. I mean, he's such a wonderful writer and storyteller. And he got back to me and said, "Eliot, I'd love to. I enjoyed meeting you at the whatever festival we met at. I think it was the Virginia Festival of the Book." And I've had him on my podcast program, and so I've actually had a chance to talk with him. And he said, "I'd love to blurb your book," but he said, "I'm right up against the deadline." He said, my first draft's got to be into my agent or to my publisher in a month, and I just don't have time to get to it. But I've never had an author that I've asked to blurb say, "Nah, I'm just not going to do it." I'm not. Don't bother me. Go away. Shoo fly. Leave me alone. Kind of thing. And so I think that speaks to the power of connections and relationships, like we were talking about. So there's two ways, and sometimes your publisher will even ask you. One of my publishers for Code for Murder reached out and said, we're gonna get this blurb by so and so. Do you have anybody in your network that you'd like to reach out to, or that we could reach out to on your behalf and say, hey, and I said, well, I met so and so at this festival. You can mention we met, or I attended his workshop on whatever, or her workshop on whatever. So those are typically the two ways it'll happen. Either the publisher will reach out for blurbs, or you can reach out for blurbs, or they'll ask you, kind of the middle ground is they'll ask you, is there anybody you want us to reach out to on your behalf to see if they'll blurb your book? But the only time I've had somebody say no is when they've been, in the middle of a project, or they're up against a deadline for their own stuff. And I certainly understand that.
Yeah, I always wondered how that worked, how the people got blurbs on their book, if it just was an organic thing, or how that all works. So that's really interesting, the way that works. Yeah. So for how do you hone your craft? Are there certain resources you recommend to aspiring writers or people who are getting started in the process to improve their writing?
Yes, I would say first thing I would say is go to a writing conference. When I first got started, I always told myself that I would go to one big national writing conference every year. That was kind of my vacation, because they can get a little pricey. By the time you pay they're oftentimes in big cities. They're oftentimes at very nice hotels with convention centers attached to them. And that can get a little pricey, but if you have to fly, and if you have to stay, and you have to, meals and all of that, of course, you certainly want to take book buying money so you can buy books while you're there, and load up your suitcase and make it overweight, which charges you another fee on when the airline says your bag's too heavy because you got all these books, or if you ship them back to wherever you live. So I would encourage folks to do that. Go to one really big book festival or writing conference every year. I mentioned the Southern Festival of Books in Nashville is a great one. The Texas Book Festival in Austin is a huge event. It's a great one. The American Library Association has their annual meetings every year. Usually they're in Washington, D.C., but sometimes they're in Philadelphia. I think this year it's going to be in Philadelphia. So something like that. Miami Book Festival is a really good one down at Miami-Dade Community College, and it's always right before Thanksgiving. It's usually the weekend before Thanksgiving. It's a big one. So go to one like that, because that's where you can meet the John Grishams and the Nora Robertses and the Lee Childs, and those kinds of writers typically go to those kinds of festivals. So if you want a chance
Wow.
to hear them and meet them and hear them talk about their book, that's a great place to go. But also go to regional book festivals. You can just do a Google search of book festivals in my city or state and see what comes up. There's two magazines I think that all writers ought to subscribe to. One is called The Writer. The
Hmm.
other is called Writer's Digest. They have a lot of really good tips and strategies. Usually every issue is themed around a genre. So the Writer just did their magazine just came out for November. It was all on memoir writing. So it was
Oh,
all
wow.
strategies and tips on how to write memoir. Writer's Digest, I think the one that they did over the summer was all on nonfiction. How to write nonfiction, really gripping, interesting nonfiction. And so there's articles in there about craft. There's articles in there from nonfiction writers giving tips and advice. Those magazines oftentimes will have a classified section at the back for publishers and journals and agents that are looking for new work and how to get in contact with them. So I would recommend folks getting those two magazines. I would also encourage folks to join a writing group if there is one in your community to get involved so that you can sort of collaborate and have a place to share your work. If there's not one in your community, start one. Easiest place to do that and the easiest way to do that. I get questions from time to time from people that want to start a writing group, and I say, go to your public library, go to your local public library, find out who the librarian is responsible for in terms of groups and PR, and just go and say, hey, I want to start a writing group. Can you help me? Because they've got access to Friends of the Library lists. They know people, they know other librarians and other libraries. They know teachers at public school level and oftentimes at the college level. They know college level librarians. They know everything. Librarians are great. And they can help you, reach out to other people. They can share news about your writing group at the library and also through their listservs and their email lists. That's a great place to start. So get involved in a writing group or start one of your own if there's not one in your community. You'll be amazed at how many people will join that are writers and want a place to kind of come together and collaborate about their writing, but never knew how to get it started. So those would be some resources I would start with. And then I would say read a lot in the genre you're interested in writing in, but also read outside your genre. I typically go in sort of fits with my reading. I will read, fiction for a while, then I get tired of that, and I'll read nonfiction for a while, and then I'll get tired of that, and I'll read, biography for a while, then I'll go back to fiction. But I just give a quick example. When I'm trying to build setting, I think some of our best setting writers who write setting are science fiction writers
Hmm.
because they have to build these whole worlds and these whole places out of their imagination, but at the same time make it seem like a real place you could actually exist. So when I'm looking for inspiration for setting, oftentimes I'll look at some science fiction work. I think some of our best writers who understand relationships and what brings people together and pulls people apart are romance writers. What attracts two people who have nothing in common together? Two people from opposite ends of the tracks. What brings them together? Well, romance writers are so good at that, at laying that out and explaining that. And so I would encourage you to read outside your genre too, because you pick up tips and techniques and strategies from a lot of other writers in different genres too. So those would be my steps for getting started. And never be afraid to try new things. Never be afraid to learn new things. Never be afraid to ask questions. Never be afraid to reach out and seek help. This philosophy has become really apparent to me, not only in writing but in life. The worst someone can tell you is no,
Yeah.
or not respond at all, which is kind of like no, I guess.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to contact an author whose book you really loved and say, hey, I loved your book. If they're on Twitter, go to their website. I can't tell you how many relationships I've made with other writers just by doing that, just by saying, hey, read your book, loved it. Can't wait for your next one. And that starts a conversation. So don't be afraid to reach out, ask questions. The worst someone can tell you is no.
Your answer is so interesting to me because I would have never thought to go to a public library to start a writers group. And most people that I've asked that question, what's funny is most of the time they'll tell me, well, there's writing groups on Facebook, and then they always say, well, I hate the Facebook groups. I never use it. It's useless, but that's a good place to start. Well, I don't use Facebook, so I don't know firsthand if they're any good or not. But I've heard a lot of people complain about them, that they're pointless and they're a waste of time. So I think it's great that you have different answers for that because I would have never thought to start with the librarian.
Yes, and something else I've learned, and I started one of these groups back in West Virginia when I was living there. In a city I was living in, we started a writing group just kind of that way. I had some people that had contacted me and said, we'd like to start a writing group in this area. And another benefit, an ancillary benefit of going to the library is oftentimes the library will give you a space to use for free to meet.
Hmm.
Because that helps them out. They can put that on their list of activities or their list of events that they've got going on in the library, and they can give you a facility, a room or a meeting space, sometimes with computers if you need to, or projection equipment if you need that. So you get those benefits as well. But yeah, that I highly recommend if you're trying to start a writing group, go to your local public library and start there. You will be amazed at the connections that they have, the resources that they have for that kind of thing, but how helpful and welcoming they will be to your group, particularly as you're getting started.
Wow, that's a wonderful answer. I think that's really going to help people out because I haven't heard that one before, so that's good. And do you believe in writer's block?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I don't believe in writer's block. I believe in writer's distraction.
Okay.
Not to twist not to twist your question around, or to give a politician's answer and just not really address it. I think that for me, and this is just speaking from my perspective, the way I get writing done is by looking at my calendar and blocking off time to write.
Mhm.
And I think that, if I don't do that, then there's always going to be laundry to do. There's going to be dishes to wash. There's going to be grass to cut. There's going to be cars to wash. There's going to be pets to take to the vet, on and on and on, groceries to go get, those kinds of things. And so I have to carve out time in every week. I try to write at least 5 days a week. Sometimes I don't quite get there. Sometimes it's 3 or 4, depending on what I've got going on, but I try to write at least 5 days a week.
Mhm.
And I just have to look at my calendar and say, okay, on Wednesday afternoon, I've got a block of time from 1 to 3. I'm going to write. And I'm going to go into my office at home, or I'm going to go on campus at school and barricade myself in there, or I'm going to go to Panera Bread or a coffee shop or wherever and write. But that for 2 hours, that's writing time. I'm turning the phone off. I'm not logging into Facebook. I'm not checking my email. It's just me and the Word document and my notes for that 2 hour amount of time. And so that's the only way I get things done. And so I feel like, I don't know if I have writer's block, but I have writer's distraction, in that if I don't do that, I'm always going to find something else to fill that slot of time.
Yeah.
And not that those other things aren't important, because they are, but at the same time, you don't make any progress on a project if the distractions are constant, and the distractions are always taking place over your writing. You really got to protect your writing time and make it just as important as your dinner time, your sleeping time, your exercise time, your TV watching time, whatever it is that you like to do. So I don't think I have writer's block, but I've suffered over the years from writer's distractions. And so that method I found is the only way I can get things done. Is I just have to block time and say that's writing time, and that's all that's going to get done during that time. And I tell everybody in my sphere of influence, leave me alone from 1 until 3, or if I didn't answer, or if somebody says, why didn't you answer my call? I called you at 2:30. I know you were home. I was writing.
Yeah.
Usually when I say that they're like, oh, okay, I understand.
Yeah.
But you have to be that way with your time, with your writing time, or otherwise there's always going to be something tugging at your time and your attention, pulling you
Mhm.
somewhere else.
And when you write, do you listen to music?
I cannot.
Oh.
I can't listen to music. I have to have. I can write in coffee shops and places like Panera Bread, because the noise is kind of white noise.
Mhm.
The clanking of plates and that kind of thing, kind of is ambient white noise. But no, I can't listen to music. I can't watch television. I have some writer friends that can watch TV, or like to have the TV on while they're writing. I can't do, especially if it's something where there's dialogue. There's no way
Yeah.
I can focus. I was always that way. I've always been that way, even as a student when I was in college. I mean, I had to find the quietest place in the library to study, because I just got distracted too easily. So I can deal with a little bit of just kind of ambient white noise. I have some friends, that writers, like to write in the park. I can't write in the park because there's dogs barking and cars zooming by, and people playing football and all that kind of stuff. It's
Yeah.
too distracting. So I can have a little bit of ambient white noise, but I like to have pretty quiet where I can really hone in and focus.
And because of the subject matter in some of your books, have you ever looked back at previous crimes that have been committed and made sure that these crimes didn't actually happen? Has that ever been a concern for you?
Well, sometimes it has been. I try to certainly, one of the great inspirations I get for crime stories is looking at small town newspapers, all over the country. And you can do that now online for the
Right.
most part for free, or you can get so many free articles. But if there's been a murder committed in a small town somewhere, the local newspaper is going to cover that all the way through till the very end, from the moment the body's discovered until till there's a trial, till there's a conviction or an acquittal. And because oftentimes that's the big story in that small town.
Oh
So you
yeah.
get a lot of really rich details. You learn a lot about prosecutorial procedure. You learn a lot about police procedure, who they've talked to, what they've done, how they've collected evidence from that. So I try to make sure, if it is something, I tell people my crimes and my thriller stories are quote unquote very loosely based on real events, because I will take the kernel of an actual crime, but I'll totally change it around. I'll totally spin it around. The victim will be a different gender. The victim will be somebody. Maybe it's not the daughter that was murdered, if it was based on a real scene, or the son that was murdered. Maybe it was the parent or the grandparent, or the daughter or son's boss or teacher or
Mm.
something like that. So you make it different enough that it's not similar, but it's almost impossible not to have some similarity, but not because every crime is different, but the scenarios that happen after the crime, the investigation, the prosecutorial process when that gets to that point. I mean, it has to follow certain laws and standards, and so some of that never changes no matter what the circumstances are. There has to be evidence collected. There has to be interviews done by the detective. There has to be, collaboration amongst, with the district attorney or a prosecutor, if you want to work that into your novel. All that kind of follows pretty standard procedure, because it's the law. That's what stands up in court. But the crimes themselves, I try to very loosely base, sometimes on real events. I had a detective one time, Steve, tell me, he said, humans are the most that I talked to. He said humans are the most dangerous creatures on the planet, and I didn't get it what he was talking about at first. And he said, because human beings will do to other human beings what animals in the wild won't even do to each other. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, if you think about, he used a great white shark, for example. He said a great white shark attacks for two reasons: to eat, to mate, or to protect its territory if it feels threatened.
Mhm.
But he said people will destroy another human being physically over things that are much smaller and much more trivial than that. And so I think about that too when I'm thinking about setting up plots for thriller novels too. Is that human beings will do to other human beings what animals in the wild won't do to one another.
Mm.
So that helps me kind of loosen up some of the real circumstances that might surround a case.
That is terrifying, isn't it?
Oh, it is. I mean,
Yeah.
and he said that at first it was kind of tongue in cheek, but he was not laughing or joking about that. And he's retired now from law enforcement, but he said, you just have no idea what one human will do to another human over something so silly as, money, or so silly as, they felt disrespected, or so
Mhm.
silly over, you broke the windshield in my car accidentally. You threw a football on it, broke my windshield. Stuff like that. That even the biggest, most deadliest animals in the wild wouldn't do to another animal unless they were trying to eat, mate, or protect if they felt threatened, if they felt physically threatened. But he said what people do to other people for lesser things is just unbelievable. It is the one thing about law enforcement that he never, I think he was 25 or 26 years in law enforcement. He said, I never understood that. I could never figure that out, why people do things to other people for such silly, trivial things.
Have you talked to many detectives or people in law enforcement for reference, or just for tips or for things that they would do in certain situations for your books?
I do. I do. I've talked to several, some in Mississippi, some in West Virginia, where I'm from, some in Kentucky, where I spent some time. most of those conversations are off the record, but on the record. That they're
Right.
willing to talk to me, but I can't use their name. I can't identify them in the acknowledgments pages. But once they realize I'm not from the media, from the traditional media, and I'm not there to do a sort of a hit piece on the police department,
Mm-hmm.
they're very open and honest to talk about their experiences. And I usually go in, and I'm very cognizant of their time. So I usually go in with 5 or 10 specific questions that I want to ask, and I think long and hard about what I want to ask because I realize, hey, I may only have this detective's time for 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to get the most out of that 30 minutes. So I go in with a plan. I don't waste their time. I get right to the issues. I'll ask clarifying questions if they mention something that I want to follow up on. But it's fascinating to hear them talk about what they see, what they experience, that the public has no idea. We typically see what they do on TV, or we've watched that TV show Cops when it was on, and that
Mm-hmm.
kind of gives a little bit of insight. But so much of what we think they do is part of what they do, but they do so much more. And I'm fascinated as a writer with the emotional and psychological toll that their work takes on them.
Oh yeah.
And I'm fascinated with how do they balance, how do they find that work-life balance? How do they, if you're investigating a murder, how do you set that aside at the end of a shift and go home and then be a husband to your wife, or a wife to your husband, or a mother or father to your 4-year-old, and just fall back into that life, knowing that in 3 hours you may get called out to another homicide investigation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fascinated by that line of their work, and I try to depict that accurately in a Final Call, in Stacy's books, A Final Call and Code for Murder, and then my other series with Ronan McCullough, who's a male homicide detective. I try to put those aspects of what they do into the story, because I'm amazed at how they're able to balance all of that and be able to be so effective at their job, but also be a great husband and a great father. And some of them aren't too. I mean, some of them will say, I was a lousy husband, I was a lousy father, because
Mm-hmm.
I let my work dominate. My work was my life, and I put everything else on the back burner. And so that all of that, I'm fascinated about that line of work, and I love to ask questions about that. And I've been very fortunate that folks have been very open to talk with me about that side of their life, in addition to kind of the police stuff too. But
Mm-hmm.
I try to imbue some of that emotional, psychological toll that takes on them in all of my stories too, so that these characters seem real and seem human.
It is amazing that they're able to do what they can do and still, like you said, just turn it off and on when well, some of them can, but they do a lot of things. It is really amazing to me too. So I have two more questions for you. So
Okay.
the next one is, what was your first job?
Oh, my first job. My first job was I worked in the print shop for the communications office at the West Virginia Department of Agriculture. We were responsible for all the brochures, all the printings, all of the letterhead, all of everything that went both internally within the department, but out to farmers and farmers markets and agricultural based organizations and the legislature and all of
Wow.
that stuff. So that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of standing on your feet a lot. It was a lot of getting your clothes stained with ink and all kinds of other things. But it was great. It was great. I love the guys I worked with. They were so nice to me, very kind to me. And it was a great experience. It was the first time I had to be at work at a certain time, and I had to sign in and sign out, and only got so long for lunch, and all those things that we typically know of in work settings. So yeah, that was my first job.
Oh wow, that sounds like a lot of fun.
It
That's a
was
great
fun.
first job. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And it paid $10 an hour at the time. And at the time, I think minimum wage was $3.75
Oh
then.
wow,
So I bought my first car with that job. So
very nice.
I
Wow.
was I felt like Scrooge McDuck or
Yeah.
Daddy Warbucks or something when I had that job. And all my other friends were lifeguards and things like that, making $3.75 an hour, and here I was making $10 an hour.
Yeah.
Woohoo!
Scrooge McDuck. So many in your money after you went home. Yeah.
Right. That's right. That might be
So
dating myself, my Scrooge McDuck.
no, that's what I thought of too. Is Scrooge McDuck. Yeah, it's great stuff. So the last question I have for you is, if you were in my position, was there any question that you would have asked had roles been reversed? So was there anything that you would think would have been a good question?
No, I think you did a fantastic job,
Hmm.
and I don't think there's anything that we didn't talk about that as it relates to writing and publishing and books and all of that. So I appreciate it, and appreciate you having me on, and thanks so much for the good questions and for providing authors a space where we can come on and talk about you know what we do and why we do it, and this crazy world of writing and publishing. So
Yeah.
I appreciate the opportunity, Steve, very much.
Oh, definitely appreciate you taking the time, and I live vicariously through all of you crazy writers, because I don't know if I can do it. So it's great to hear your perspective and your experiences. It's really fascinating to me. So if someone is looking for you to connect with you, is there a place? Do you have a website, or you mentioned a podcast? Where can people find you?
I do. I have a website. It's currently undergoing some revision and renovation, so some things may look out of place, and some fonts might not match, and all of that as it's getting redone. But it's just my name, EliotParker.com, EliotParker.com. I've got information about my books, where you can get them. I have a contact form if you want to contact me directly with questions or comments. The podcast that I host is called Now Appalachia. It is carried through the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and it can be heard anywhere you like to get podcasts: iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, SoundCloud, any of those places, that carry podcasts. That's where you can get it. And we interview authors and publishers that are either from Appalachia, living and writing in Appalachia, or have Appalachian themes connected to their work. So it's been a lot of fun. We're in our 4th year of doing
Wow.
those interviews, and it's been great fun. Again, I've met so many wonderful authors and publishers and through that process. And so if you get a chance to check it out, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And if you've got a suggestion for an Appalachian author that I need to interview, please let me know that too, because I'm always on the hunt for Appalachian authors and the latest Appalachian books to profile. So if you've got a tip or suggestion, I'm certainly open and willing to get that feedback. So yeah, so those are the two easiest places to get a hold of me. And you can get a final call at Amazon or anywhere you like to buy books. If you're please try to get it from your local independent bookstore if you have one in your community. If they don't have it on the shelves when you go there, you can certainly ask them, and they can order you a copy, and you can usually get it within a day or two. So
Yeah, support your local bookstores for sure when you can. Yeah. So thank you for coming by again. I really appreciate you coming, and such. I have so much fun with these conversations. So thank you for taking the. I know you're busy, have a lot going on. So thank you for taking the time to chat.
oh, my pleasure, Steve. Thanks so much for having me.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks again. Thanks everybody.